This is a test. This is a test. Now I'm gonna turn it over to the west.
Wings, 6 pieces, sometimes 10 pieces, with barbecue sauce, please.
Malaysia 370 morning.
Malaysia 370 standby and Malaysian 6 is cleared to Frankfurt via Agosa Alpha departure 6000 feet squawk 2106. Malaysian 370 request level.
370, we are ready, requesting flight 350 to Beijing.
Malaysian 370 is cleared to Beijing via Pibos Alpha departure 6000 feet squawk 2157.
Beijing, people on 1000 2157. Malaysia 370, thank you.
Malaysian 370, welcome to over the ground.
Malaysia 370, selamat pagi. Identify climb flight level 180, cancel the side turn right direct to Ikari.
Okay, level 180, direct Ikari, Malaysian 370.
370, contact lampu radar 1326 kenai.
Alright, 1326, Malaysian 370. Lampu control, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, lampu radar, good morning, climb flight level 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, climb flight level 350.
Level 350, Malaysian 370. Malaysian 370, maintaining level 350.
Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, maintaining level 350.
Malaysian 370. Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9,
Good night, Malaysian 370.
Welcome to episode 18 of 1 minute and 43 seconds, a true Unsolved Mysteries podcast. Today we are bringing you the highly anticipated MH370 Part 2. Now, a lot of people have asked me, when is Part 2 coming? I thought this was supposed to be an MH370 podcast. Well, this podcast, as many of you know, is actually named after the mystery of missing Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. And that is because it was 1 minute and 43 seconds after the airplane's final radio call to air traffic control that the plane disappeared from radar and made a strange turn. So this podcast is based off of that mystery. It's inspired by that mystery. So I want to assure everybody that we will constantly discuss MH370 on this show. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today. I am somewhat acquainted with him. His name is Wesley, and he happens to be my boyfriend. Wesley, thank you so much for taking the time and agreeing to be on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself or say anything about yourself?
Well, my name is Wesley. I like to watch movies, I like to exercise, and I like to relax.
Wesley is very familiar with the MH370 mystery because it's been one that I've been fascinated with since the beginning, and he's had to hear me talk about it and hear me talk about different theories and endure while I watch countless YouTube videos and documentaries. So I thought, what better person to have be on MH370 Part 2? Right, Wes?
Absolutely. I've definitely picked up some ideas about what happened from not even just paying attention, but just being just it being on in the background, various documentaries you've been watching, you just discussing it with me. I've learned some things.
Yes, and if you haven't listened to part 1 of MH370, we actually did that I actually did that for episode 1 of this podcast. So if you haven't heard that, or if you're not really familiar with the case, I highly recommend you to listen to episode 1. There's also countless documentaries and videos on this because it is such a big mystery. So check those out and then come right back here and listen to part 2. So today I thought I would just go through the events of March 8th, 2014. And Wesley, you could provide your thoughts and we can talk about some theories and see where we go from there.
That sounds good.
Okay, great. So as we all know, MH370 was a scheduled flight from Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, to Beijing, China. It was scheduled to be 5 hours and 34 minutes. And there were 227 passengers on board and 12 crew. So this was a red-eye flight that took off from Kuala Lumpur Airport at 12:41 a.m. So this was by all means a routine standard flight. The pilot in command of this particular flight was Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah. He was 53 years old and he was from Penang. He joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 1981 and he had accumulated over 18,000 flying hours with Malaysia Airlines. The first officer was 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid. He joined Malaysia Airlines in 2007, and this was actually his final flight before he was to take an exam to move to the next to be a captain, as far as I understand. As many that are familiar with this mystery know, the majority of passengers on this flight were from China, but there were a variety of people from a lot of nations, a lot from Malaysia. There were some from Indonesia, also Russia, France, Iran, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Australia, just to name a few. So everything is normal, right? So the first officer is communicating with air traffic control while the plane is on the ground. And that's Farik Hamid. He's the 27-year-old. And they take off without any issue at 12:41. And as far as anyone can tell, everything's normal. So they're making routine calls to air traffic control. While they're in the air, it seems like Zahari was communicating with the tower, whereas Farik was flying. And this is like a common thing, I think, with pilots. Whoever is communicating with air traffic control, the opposite pilot is flying, which makes sense.
Okay, so Farik was in control at the time.
Yes. And the last communication came from the pilot at 1:19 a.m. when Captain Zahari acknowledged a transition from air traffic control to the plane. So they said, basically they instructed him, since this was the area where Malaysian airspace was turning into Vietnamese airspace, air traffic control instructed Zahari, the captain, to change frequencies and check in with Vietnam as they were leaving Malaysia. So they said, "Good night," and he replied back, "Good night, Malaysian 370. Totally routine.
Routine handoff of communications.
Up until this point, it was routine. So the crew was supposed to contact Ho Chi Minh City, which is in Vietnam. They were supposed to contact them basically the first minute or so after they entered the airspace. But this never came. So for some odd reason, Vietnamese air traffic control waited to do anything about this disappearance. The plane should have checked in right away, and it didn't. So it wasn't until 20 minutes later that they contacted the Malaysian air traffic control to ask where the plane was, which is a long time. But I can speculate and I can imagine that in this day and age, in the 2000s anyway, that flying is so safe statistically and that there's so much technology that I'm sure maybe the people on duty just didn't bat an eye. when the plane didn't check in right away. Maybe they weren't paying attention.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long there's like it normally is. I thought it was just supposed to be like almost an instantaneous thing, like just say goodbye and then check in with a new place.
That is correct. That is what it was supposed to be, but it seems like somebody in Vietnam was not paying attention at that time when they were supposed to check in. So what followed next was kind of confusing because Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam checked in with Malaysia. Malaysia said that the plane was supposed to be in Cambodian airspace right now, okay? The plane was never supposed to be over Cambodia. So this turned out to be incorrect. And Vietnam kept checking in with Malaysia to confirm. And it came out later that the plane was never supposed to enter Cambodia, and it was based only on flight projection and not an actual radar position of the plane. What we know from satellite later, which they didn't know at this time, was that the plane would make a very sharp left turn back towards Malaysia. And if everybody listened to episode 1, you know the details. If you're familiar with this case, you know generally what happened here. But yes, and so this was about 40 minutes into the flight where the plane abruptly changed course, because it would have been a straight shot from Kuala Lumpur to China for the most part. So this was definitely a deviation from the scheduled flight path. So about 1:19 a.m., it makes a huge turn, and then it flies back over it flies back over Malaysia. And it continues over Malaysia until it takes another turn around Penang Island, which, if you recall, is the island that Zahari is from, the captain. And many people have speculated that this was him getting a final look at his hometown before he meant to take the flight out into the depths of the Indian Ocean and basically end his life and those of all on board. So I should mention that when the plane turned or made its abrupt turn, just before that, radar was lost. It sounds like that would have happened because somebody switched off the transponder on the airplane, and either that or the transponder failed. But the reason they were able to pick up the movements after it turned is because of military radar. So after its turn and its flight back over Malaysia, it made another turn around the island of Penang. and then it began to fly northwest from Penang. That was over the Strait of Malacca and then up towards the Andaman Sea. And about 2:22 Malaysian time, that's when the radar, the military radar, that was the final signal that was sent. So at that point, basically, it flew out of the range of military radar, or beyond the scope.
I see. So, I don't know. Just from what little information we have, from the top of my head, I see like 3 possible reasons why it could turn around. Some type of like accident where it needed to, the pilot wanting to for some other reason, or possibly some other party forcing the pilot's action. But just how quickly it went from saying goodnight to the other air traffic controller to the transponder going off, and then the plane turning, not by an autopilot, but just a pilot doing it, just because of how soon it happened. It makes me think it's more likely that whoever was in control of the plane at the time, the pilots, they turned the plane, but for what reason, not sure.
Yeah, and it does seem like interesting timing, right? Because if something catastrophic were to happen, what are the chances the radar would have shut off and then the plane would have turned? It just seems like a very interesting time for that to take place. It's almost like if somebody was meaning to do this, that they would have had to have known the exact time that the flight would be that they would be signing off with Malaysian airspace.
And I'm not familiar with the technology of the plane at the time in 2014. Even if most of the passengers were asleep, the ones that weren't, would their phones have had service or anything in that area? I'm just not familiar with the details at all.
That's a really good question, and the answer is that there was one sign of a signal connecting with a tower on the plane. So none of the passengers' phones connected with any tower in the air. Now, if they were connected to Wi-Fi, that's another story. But nobody had heard from anyone on the plane, so there's that. But the first officer, Farid Hamid's phone, did make a connection with a phone tower, which is very interesting. So it was around the time in the flight when the plane would have been over Penang Island. The first officer's phone actually connected with a tower very briefly. Now, this wasn't determined to be a phone call or a text or something like that, because nothing like that went through, but they were able to tell that a brief connection between a tower and his phone took place. So that would just mean basically that the phone was on at the time that this ping occurred. So it's also been theorized because of this that the plane must have been below 10,000 feet. So did whoever was in control of the plane descend from cruising altitude, which is, 35,000 feet, down to closer to 10,000 feet? And if so, I've also heard that it's kind of uncommon for pilots to have their phones on mid-flight. So was he trying to signal for help? Or did he leave his phone on? Did he forget to turn it off? It's all been a giant point of speculation.
So, not much detail besides that it just tried to make a connection, or it was just on for a second.
Correct, and that would not, from what I gather, it would not be able to take place at an altitude that a plane is normally flying, which it should have been at 35,000 feet at that time in flight, but as we know, the flight did not go according to plan. Now again, I'm going to skip over some details because we covered these details in episode 1 and they're all available online. So what we're going to do now is kind of talk about the theories. What was the reason that this flight went off course? Where is the flight, or where is the plane? What happened? We're going to kind of go through the theories for this episode. So what I thought we could do, Wes, is kind of go through each of the theories and talk about your thoughts on the theory, whether you think it's likely, whether you think it's unlikely, the flaws with it, whatever you have to say about it. So the first one I want to talk about is hijacking. So under this theory, the plane was on its course to Beijing, China, and at some point hijackers were able to gain access to the cockpit, whether through force with flight attendants or otherwise unknown measures. And they were flying the plane to an unknown destination, and they obviously did not. Maybe their goal was to crash the plane in the remote Indian Ocean. Maybe it was to target another city, but it didn't go to plan. So curious what your thoughts are on a hijacking scenario.
So as far as reasons for hijacking, it's kind of hard to find one, which to me would make it kind of unlikely, as no other group, no terrorist groups or anything have claimed responsibility, or
that's a great point.
There was no message sent.
And that is a big thing with terrorist groups, is if they are carrying out an act like this, they want the world to know about it. Obviously, that's what they're doing. And nothing like that ever came. So no major terrorist organization ever claimed responsibility for this. So it does seem a bit far-fetched.
Yeah, it does sound very unlikely. Not that there couldn't just be someone that wanted to do it just for unknown reasons. Unlikely, but anything's possible.
Well, let me throw this at you. Let's say this was a hijacking, and let's say it was kind of a failed attempt. Let's say the hijackers wanted to fly to some city that we don't know and carry out a 9/11 style attack. Maybe the pilots intervened, maybe the passengers intervened, and the plot was foiled. Would the terrorist group then be embarrassed? Oh, that was not how I wanted it to go. Better not say anything, because that's embarrassing.
But then what happens to the plane?
No, I'm saying maybe they went for a city, right? But the struggle ensued. And you know how on September 11th, 3 of the planes, obviously 2 of them hit the Twin Towers, 1 of them hit the Pentagon, but there was another one that was, they think, headed towards the White House, but the passengers intervened and they overcame the hijackers, but the plane ended up crashing. What if something like that happened here, where the goal was to go to a city or something and cause more carnage, but somebody interfered and a struggle ensued and they weren't able to save themselves, but they were able to save whoever on the ground?
Sure, but
Sure.
But just by judging by its final predicted or final estimated flight path, it would seem that with its flight path and that contact ended, and very abruptly within 2 minutes, everything just sort of happened. It just sort of makes me doubt it unless something very catastrophic happened, or a number of things, it combines with another theory. Everyone got hypoxic during it, or everyone was somehow incapacitated, and then the plane just kept on going. It's possible, but
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned hypoxia, because that is actually our next theory. So this theory is a mechanical failure theory, and some people may know about Helios Flight 522, and this was a scheduled flight from Lamaka, Cyprus to Prague, Czech Republic, with a stopover in Athens, Greece.
Is that the one with the golfer guy?
No, this one is a different one. I believe that was the same sort of thing that happened with the flight you're referring to. But anyway, so what happened on this flight, Helios Air 522, was the maintenance crew that was responsible for checking the flight between flights to make sure everything was working properly. They were checking the air conditioning system, which is also what pressurizes the cabin when you go up into 35,000 feet altitude, because you can't breathe at that level, as you know, because the air is too thin. So the cabin is pressurized, so the air is breathable. Anyway, so something, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, for Helios 522, the maintenance person forgot to switch the pressurization system from manual back to auto. And usually it's an automatic process. But anyway, so what happened tragically on this flight was the crew took off, and because the pressurization system was not on auto and it was on manual, the cabin did not pressurize properly and there was a leak. So what happens with hypoxia, it basically means your body is starved of oxygen. So during a flight, there can be two sorts of incidences where this would impact people. The first one is a rapid decompression, and that would be something like the fuselage was punctured, right? And that would be a rapid decompression in which the air would be sucked out. Okay?
Sure, like on movies.
Like on movies, yeah, exactly. But the other one, which is even more scary, is a slow decompression where there's a small leak that, you're not aware of, that kind of just slowly sucks the air out. So basically, this is horrifying. People just slowly are deprived of oxygen and they just kind of fall asleep and never wake up.
So you sort of succumb to it like carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yes. By the way, get a carbon monoxide detector in your home if you do not have one. Hundreds of Americans suffer every year. So what happened on Helios 522 was the pilots, as they were being deprived of oxygen, they became more and more confused, because that's one of the first signs of hypoxia, is that you are confused. You don't know what's going on. And this happens in literally a matter of seconds. So you have probably up to a minute of functional capabilities until it takes over and you pass out. So sadly, during Helios 522, the pilots were confused about what was happening. They were getting warnings. The oxygen masks dropped in the cabin, and everybody basically succumbed to oxygen deprivation. The plane eventually ran out of fuel and crashed into the mountains. So that theory has been brought forth for MH370. People have often wondered, did something like this happen on board MH370 because it would have caused confusion, it would have caused illogical behavior, and the fact that the plane flew on for 6 or 7 hours after, it would have flown on for 6 or 7 hours to the Indian Ocean, the southern Indian Ocean, before it gave out because of fuel exhaustion. So that points to the fact that it flew on, I think, let's talk about that. The fact that it flew on for hours and hours into the southern Indian Ocean without making any turns after that one turn that we talked about, that sounds like people were unconscious on that plane.
Yeah, I would tend to agree after that initial turn that you said that they would have felt, because it was very a sharp turn. It could lead to the idea that, like you said, that everyone was hypoxic and just confused before they ultimately what's the word? Before they ultimately succumbed.
Yeah, and the people that criticize this theory, they point to the fact that the plane made not just the one turn, it made 1, 2, 3 turns over the course of its flight. So it turned left back towards Malaysia after its final contact with air traffic control. It turned again around the island of Penang when it flew northwest, and then it took a final turn south towards the Indian Ocean. So this happened over a couple hours. So if something were to cause them to be confused to the point they were making weird decisions, it also would have probably caused them to die before that amount of time. Do you know what I'm saying?
So what you're saying is that if there was something happening and after the initial turn, say everyone was hypoxic because there was no response from anyone, there were still multiple turns, and because the first turn was made by a human, it would be unlikely for the autopilot to kick in and make those subsequent turns. It would still have to be someone controlling it, most likely the pilot, just because of how quick or the timing where the pilot said goodbye to air traffic control and then made the turn. So you're saying that if it was hypoxia or something causing hypoxia, they wouldn't have survived the time it took for the subsequent turns to have been performed.
That's correct. I am saying that, and I should note that actually investigators determined that yes, the first of the 3 turns had to have been made by a person, but the second 2 turns could have been made by an autopilot or it could have been made by a person. But if those second 2 turns were made from autopilot, it would have had to have been programmed in by a person. So, as I mentioned earlier, the flight from Malaysia to Beijing was basically straight north. After this initial turn that we've already decided, or we've already said had to be a human being doing it, the following 2 turns either would have had to been performed by someone or they would have had to been programmed into the system by someone.
I see. And also the flight pattern after the initial turn that was beyond the scope of an autopilot. The interesting about those paths is that it sort of falls in sort of like what am I trying to say?
You're talking about how it's between countries?
Like how it is sort of like a path that you would sort of take if you wanted to avoid being detected or questioned, just because of it not going anywhere out of the way. It just seems to go in between places, and even next to the military, it was just far enough away, I guess, that no one really looked into it, which is really weird on its own. But it would seem really unlikely that this would just be random, right?
Yeah, so basically, I think what you're trying to get at is the fact that after this plane made the turn and dropped radar signal, it kind of skirted along the borders of different Southeast Asian countries. So it flew back over Malaysia, but it kind of was going in and out of the border from Thailand. So Thailand could have easily looked at the plane and said, oh, you know what? That's Malaysia's plane. We don't, that's not ours. We don't have to worry about it. And also vice versa. Malaysia could have thought that's Thailand's plane. And if you remember at this point, they don't have a radar connection with MH370. The radar signal has been lost, but it's being tracked on military radar. Anyway, so the plane is kind of going between countries, and that could be seen as a reason that somebody was trying to avoid detection, right?
Yeah, it could be. It just seems like all the passengers are incapacitated in some way, and there's someone making controls or inputs to the plane.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. So what makes you think that the passengers are incapacitated? Because after 9/11 occurred, it's policy now that the cockpit is completely locked and secured from, that way no passengers will breach the cockpit. So I think only the pilots and the flight attendants, maybe one flight attendant, has the code to get into the cockpit. So what makes you think that they're incapacitated?
Well, not necessarily incapacitated at that time, but that there was never any response from anyone at any time after that. I don't know if it was possible for any of them to make a cell phone call or anything, or to message someone on like a text or social media contact.
Yeah.
Or if it was if the plane was taken or something, would they have been able to confiscate all the phones? Everything just seems sort of like, for it to happen so quickly, it just seems like the most convenient way is that everyone is disabled except the pilot for some reason, or whoever's making the inputs to the plane.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up an interesting point, because it's my understanding that the pilots are able to disable wireless services. So, when you get on a plane and there's the option for Wi-Fi, I believe the electrical system was cut at the same time the radar, like the transponder, was cut, which would be a sign of somebody disabling it, in which case the passengers wouldn't have any way to contact anyone. Now, that phone ping from the first officer is interesting, because that happened, but no other signals were captured from the flight.
So, like, in a scenario with that, could it just be that his phone was just on and it connected? But would that also mean that all of the other 200 plus passengers had their phones off, like you're supposed to, I guess, on a flight? Or are you even supposed to do that? There's like airplane mode now. It just seems odd that no other phone would connect, I guess, but I don't know the scientifics behind that.
I don't understand that either, to be honest, and that almost makes me wonder. But then again, I'm thinking, if the passengers were incapacitated but somehow the first officer wasn't, if the passengers were incapacitated after the first initial turn, they wouldn't have been alive to try to connect their phones. But if that were the case, why was the first officer able to do that, if that's what he was trying to do? Because you can't convince me that everybody on that flight turned their phone off except for the first officer. I feel like if they were alive and conscious, and let's say they knew something terrible was happening, I feel like somebody would have tried something with their phone. Well, Wes, before we call it a day with this episode, I think we should talk about the prevailing theory, which a lot of experts have said that this is probably what happened, and that's that Captain Zahari Shah deliberately crashed the plane in the southern Indian Ocean, killing everyone on board.
So, for this to have happened, probably this is what would probably have happened in this case then, from my understanding, is that he said goodnight to Malaysian Air Traffic Control. Then he turned the plane after cutting is it ACARS?
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I'm not super familiar with all of the technical term, but ACARS is the Aircraft Communication and Reporting System. And yeah, so it was ACARS, and it was also
is that the same thing as
radar.
The transponder, or?
The transponder, I think, is different. The way that they track the plane's location.
So like the general radar.
Yes, from my understanding.
I see. So then, from my understanding, he would have had to cut the radar, then made the turn, and then because the turn was so abrupt, some way stopped the passengers from, or like calm the passengers down or something to make sure there was no pandemonium or some type of distress. Even though it was like late at night, they would have had to felt something.
I think they definitely would have in such an abrupt turn.
It's also possible that he got them hypoxic somehow and then put his own mask on by going up really high and then coming back down and then making a bunch of turns, or did it not capture that, or does it not?
From what I understand, the data on the altitude of the plane is disputed, but that is a theory that he turned the plane and then he ascended to a level where the passengers would have succumbed to hypoxia while putting his own oxygen mask on.
So, however you cut it, none of the passengers or the crew attempted to contact anyone, or there was no contact from them in this time while whoever was piloting the plane, Zahari or the co-pilot, was in control. And there's also some speculation that even at the end, the plane just didn't fall into the ocean after the fuel ran out. It was controlled till the end for it to land in the ocean in as few pieces as possible, I guess, or as smooth as possible.
Yeah, that's been speculated as well, because obviously we know that pieces of the plane did wash up on the East African coast, but the fuselage and the majority of the plane have never been located. And so, yeah, that is a theory, is that when it was taken into the remote Indian Ocean, let's say it was a pilot suicide, that the pilot, beyond fuel exhaustion, continued to glide the plane under his control. So it could have traveled actually up to 200 miles more beyond when it ran out of fuel, just by gliding. So a lot of people speculate that maybe he did this to hide the plane even further, because that part of the Indian Ocean where it's speculated that this plane went down is so remote, it took up to 6 days for people to even get to the area to search. So that is a theory, and I will admit the circumstances could definitely be explained by a pilot that wanted to commit suicide, but it does go against everything that we know about Zahari. As far as, I mean, his family obviously does not agree with this, and there's no way of knowing what goes on behind closed doors, but it's hard for me to wrap my mind around a person that's seemingly a family man. He seemed to be wanting to help people. He had hobbies, like he liked to cook, and he just seemed like a fun-loving person. So it's hard for me to wrap my mind around him wanting to do something like this, not just for himself, but he takes out 237 other people. 237 other people, excuse me.
Yeah, I get that, and you seem to know a lot about the person from just various documentaries and just researching the subject. But just looking at it from an objective perspective, it seems like the most, like the razor thing, it just seems like...
What's the razor thing,
like
Wesley?
Akram's razor, just the clearest path or whatever, the straightest line. It's a straight line to the answer pretty much, or what seems to be the case usually is. And with just how everything happened, it just seems like a pilot or whoever was in control of the plane was in control. And I would say it's probably unlikely that any of the other passengers were skilled enough pilots to do what the pilot did if he did ditch the plane into the ocean or control the plane and make all these turns and pilot it skirting around the lines of various countries and whatnot. It would just point to whoever was flying the plane, the pilots, And just for all this to happen, it just seemed like it had to be the pilot. But I don't know anything about the pilot, and if you don't know anything about anyone, it just seems like this is the most likely case, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, and it's very sinister, but I guess what bothers me about this, despite the fact that it's logical, I mean, it just feels like the only reason Captain Zahari is being blamed for this, or that it's being determined that it's the most likely scenario, is just because of statistical, what's the word I'm looking for? Just because of probability, because he was a skilled pilot, and he was the most skilled pilot on that flight. But at the same, like, there's still no direct evidence that it was him.
Yeah, it's kind of like a double-edged thing. Because there's no evidence that it was him, there's no really evidence at all, and it just kind of points that it would be the pilot.
What do you think of the simulator? So I believe I referenced this in episode 1, but there was a simulated flight path found on Zahari's home computer that was deleted in the time since his between his simulated flight and his disappearance, or the disappearance of MH370, there was a deleted flight on his simulator that was recovered that had a very similar route to the one MH370 took that night, which was a sharp turn and then a flight down into the southern Indian Ocean. What do you think that was? Do you think that shows premeditation, or do you think that's just a coincidence? Because people that are, opposing the fact that Zahari did this, they say, well, he had hundreds and hundreds of mapped out flights. And when you single this one out, yeah, it looks kind of bad. But at the same time, he had flights all over the place that he would do.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. From what I've seen, or from what you've shown me, he seemed just to be an enthusiast in his life outside of being a pilot as well. Making YouTube videos and tutorials and whatnot, but also sharing a great interest in this flight simulator. And I don't know enough specifically about how they recovered that data because it was deleted, whether this flight plan was a complete thing or just a combination of things that made it look like this, or how even useful this, like, who has this data, like who's the expert, or like where are we learning this from anyways,
Well, Malaysian officials recovered it from Zahari's home computer shortly after the disappearance of the flight. And from what I recall, it was a route that was mapped out on his simulator, but it was deleted. All right, Wes, well, before we wrap it up, first of all, thanks a lot for doing this with me. I know that you know a lot about this because of me, and because you've taken an interest, because I've taken an interest. So thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. But do you have any kind of final thoughts on what we've talked about? I know we kind of just scratched the surface. And again, I will be doing multiple parts of MH370. This podcast, again, is named after MH370, and it's based on MH370. It's inspired by MH370. So we will continue the conversation. But anyway, let you talk now.
Sure. I guess my final thoughts, now that I've thought about it a little bit, is that there had to have been so many coincidences and things to happen, like the lack of action from the various countries and whatnot, for this to have happened. It seems like multiple people dropped the ball. There was a very slow response from the government, and the investigation seemed slow, especially because of the wrong information at first. They were looking in the wrong area. They spent a great deal of time looking at that, and I'm not saying it's fishy, but for everything to go so wrong, it just makes it harder to find the truth, and it kind of assessed me that we may never find the truth, just because it started out so weird, and we don't really know a lot. But from what we do know, it seemed like the most likely thing would be that this was done on purpose, or like maybe not even maliciously, maybe they got hypoxic and then I don't know, but it just seems.
And they were searching, just to clarify, they were searching in the wrong area. And I mentioned this in episode 1, but they were searching in the wrong area because the flight, they were searching in the southern China Sea, which is where the flight lost radar contact with the towers. But we know now, based on other data, that the flight continued on. So that's why they were searching in the wrong area. I just wanted to note that for any listeners that forgot or...
Ultimately, it's just very unfortunate for the families of those on board, and pretty much that there's no closure and there's no real answer besides what probably happened. And we only really know that because that's through lack of evidence of anything else, essentially.
Right. And you kind of touched on this already, but my final question to you was going to be, do you think we'll ever know the answer? Do you think we'll ever find the plane, or the answer will somehow be known?
Well, when I try to think about the ocean and how big it is, and just how much time it passed, I don't know specifically, but I would imagine it would seem very, very hard, especially since we're not actively looking for it now. And I just fear as more time goes on, I'm not sure if it'll get harder to find in the ocean, but we're not looking for it now, so we won't really know until we do.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's sad that there's been so many searches, and those searches have turned up empty. I really hope one day that there can be another search and that we can somehow find answers for the sake of the families, because it's one of those things that's just the subject of so many different, if you Google MH370, you'll get 1,000 articles that are just completely, there's conspiracy theories, there's just complete speculation or tabloid clickbait things. And that has to be so hard for the families. So I hope that one day they do another search. That being said, this is going to bring us to the end of MH370 Part 2. For Part 3, I would love the input of my listeners, because there are 1,000 different things I could talk about with this case. We could talk about conspiracy theories. We could talk about the passengers. I could do an episode just based on the passengers, who was on board that night. I could do a complete episode about Zahari, the captain. I could do a complete episode about MH370, which was the other Malaysian Airlines flight that suffered a crash in 2014. 2014 was not a good year for Malaysian Airlines. But anyway, I would love for your feedback on that. What would you most like to hear about? What do you want to be discussed? So please be sure to check out the website, 143mysteries.com. And follow us on Instagram at 143mysteries. Drop me a comment, drop me a message. Let me know your thoughts. And on that note, thanks again, Wesley, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And did you do the dishes?
No. Are you going to do the dishes?
Are you going to? I thought you were going to do them. Rock, paper, scissors. I thought because I made dinner, you were going to do the dishes. Anyway, thanks for listening. We'll see you all next time. Thanks again. This podcast has been approved by Skipper the Cat. Right, Skippy?